Hello and welcome to the Hand Sewing Help Desk. My name is Sarah Woodyard and I run Sewn Company. My goal is to help you remember what your hands can do. So what that means is I'm here to demystify hand sewing, to make it accessible, to encourage you, and hopefully you'll find fun and enjoyment and some calm in hand stitching. Today, I have a couple of questions that you all have submitted, so thank you so much for your submissions. I hope that this helps you on your hand sewing journey and practice, as well as helps other people as they work their way through hand sewing. And I just want to note that hand sewing is indeed a practice. It is not something that you wake up one morning and know how to do. And honestly, I've been hand sewing for over 10 years, 15 years, I think, and it's still a practice for me. So every project is kind of a new adventure. So I just want you to be patient with yourself and try and enjoy the process as much as possible. All right, let's dive into these questions. All right, the first question is, I have been thinking about how much my hands hurt after sewing for a few days straight, like carpal tunnel, but not in my wrist, I guess. I'm like, how do people do this all the time? It's a great question. Of course, historically, people were hand sewing for the majority of the day. But as you're working, there's inherent breaks that you're going to be taking. So, one of the things that I would recommend is making sure that you're sitting correctly as you're sewing and making sure that you're rolling your shoulders back and down. If you have some sort of back support, it's always good to wear something like that. Like, for example, if you have a pair of stays, I would recommend wearing your stays as you're sewing. That was really helpful for me when I worked at the millinery shop and I wore stays all day, every day. They really helped to give me support. So one is back straight. The other thing to help with that is to make sure you're sitting in a straight back chair or you have a pillow beneath your back. If you're in a fluffy, overstuffed sofa or chair, like we have often in our living rooms, that is not going to be conducive to good sewing practice. Or sit on the floor and cross your legs. So just some sort of posture that forces you to sit upright. The other thing that I would recommend is bring the work up to you so that you're actually positioning your hands in a way that is comfortable. So you may cross, if you're sitting in a straight back chair, crossing your legs and allowing your knees to be kind of like a table. I often tell people to keep the work about the navel height. That's kind of the perfect height to make sure that you have the work positioned in a comfortable kind of ergonomic way. The other thing that I always tell people to do is we're not going to be sewing with our wrists. So instead of, so I've seen a lot of people on the internet, and no fault to anybody. This is not to shame. This is something I've kind of recognized is that when they sew, they're doing this. They're moving their wrist. And when you hand sew, you want to make sure that you are holding the needle, but it's not so tight that you're like gripping it. And I know as beginners, we can be a little bit like, oh, gotta hold it tight. But so hold the needle gently, but firm enough that it doesn't, fly out of your hands. But you want to sew actually with your whole arm. So instead of doing this, you're going to want to sew with the your entire arm. So when I'm stitching, for example, just like if I was sewing on this thing here, I would just be like pulling this direction versus like this. So it's a whole arm motion. I keep my elbow relatively kind of pulled into my side, and then I push my hand away as I'm working. So keep your hands relaxed, keep your back straight. Make sure that you're using your whole arm and not just your hands. And then beyond that, I would encourage everybody to stretch your hands if it starts to hurt. Also stretch your shoulders and stretch your back because we are using our whole upper body. So for hand stretches, I like to take my, I'm right-handed, so my right hand is the one that hurts if it starts to hurt. And this is not medical advice, I should caveat. These are just things that have helped me as it relates to tension and kind of pain. But pressing, kind of taking my hand, flattening it out, and then pressing lightly the tips of my finger with my non-dominant hand. And that helps to stretch just kind of this area and I'll kind of just stretch it. Sometimes I put it on the table even and just kind of press it. Also, icing this part of my hand is also very helpful. Furthermore, like I said, I will actually stretch my shoulder area with stretches where I put my hand up against a wall and I kind of press, that stretch that kind of goes here, just to make sure that you're kind of in alignment and you're stretching your whole upper body. So making sure you're using proper technique, making sure you're not gripping the needle too tightly. And, if you're working on a project that is really heavy fabric, or, maybe you're doing a lot of rolled hems that require a lot of really like fine motor skills or mobility, like right here at the tip of your fingers, you may want to take breaks also. Make sure that you're kind of just relaxing your body maybe every 30 minutes to 50 minutes, making sure that you're taking putting the work down for a second and just kind of take mini breaks just to give yourself a little bit of a rest. Because even though hand sewing can be sedentary in the sense that you are sitting, it's still quite active when it comes to your hand, your arm, and your shoulders. So make sure you give those a rest. So, all right, the next question is, I'm new to using linen thread for hand sewing and I find it confusing. Like, what weight of thread do you use for what project? Do you base the thread on the project or the weight of linen? Do you ever use linen thread on non-linen fabric? Help! That is a phenomenal question. So the first portion of that is, what weight of thread do you use for what project? Do you base the thread on the project or on the weight of the thread? That's kind of the main kind of gist of that question. So you do base the weight of the linen thread on the weight of the fabric. And when you're looking for linen thread, you're going to notice that there's two numbers involved. There's a first number that is a 2-digit number. So it might be like 60, 80, 90, 100. And then there's a dash, and then there's another number. So it might be a 2 or a 3. The first number indicates the weight of the thread. And this might be familiar to you if you are knitters, because they do this with yarn as well. But essentially, the higher the number, the finer the thread. So if you're working with, say, lightweight linen, I would suggest looking towards a number like 80, 90, 100 as that first one. The second number is the ply. And a ply means that there's yarn that's actually spun together. So it might be a 2-ply thread, it might be a 3-ply thread. And again, that 1 or the 2, or excuse me, the 2 or the 3 indicates the ply of that. So absolutely, you want to make sure that the thread matches the weight of the linen that you're working with. So typically projects that are like, linen aprons, if it's a lightweight linen apron, I would suggest a number about 80 or higher. Some of this is going to be personal preference, I should caveat. So sometimes like you might decide that a 60/2 works for you. But overall for lightweight stuff, I would err on the side of the 80s, 90s, and 100s. Midweight linen, I would say that 60/3 or over 2, or 80/2, 80/3. For heavyweight stuff, you might have like, for example, I have like this linen thread right here, which is 50/3, and that works well for heavyweight stuff. When it comes to, do you see linen thread used on non-linen fabric? Yes. So you could use like a heavier weight linen, like a 50/3, 50/2, or like 30/2 even, with like a heavier weight, like wool, like a wool broadcloth even. I would personally recommend more of like a heavier weight silk, but you absolutely could use linen for seaming worsted wools, wool broadcloth, obviously linen, as we talked about. I wouldn't use it on silk. Even some types of cottons, like maybe even like a cotton blend, you'd use linen on. Historically, in the 18th century, the two main popular sewing threads are going to be sewing silk and thread. Thread was synonymous with linen. So if you're sewing with just thread, it should be linen or sewing silk. And I know today we think of silk as being super fancy and expensive. Same thing with linen. It's become more of kind of an expensive material. But historically speaking, silk is very strong. And so it really was the preference for some people to use, like, for example, like utilitarian fabrics might have been sewn with silk because it is so, so strong. And it wasn't considered this super fancy material in that particular context of being, sewing silk. Same thing with linen thread. Something I do want to mention about linen thread is that you want to make sure you have your beeswax at all times, because there's like these little lumps that are sometimes on the spun linen. Also, what I have found is if you don't wax it, the fiber of the linen is eventually going to catch on the fiber of the linen you're stitching on, or the fiber of, say, like the cotton linen that you're sewing on, or the wool you're sewing on, and eventually it's going to kind of shred. So to coat that fiber, absolutely beeswax is your friend. If you're working on a really, really fine set of materials, I would, if you're using super, super, super fine linen, just be gentle with how you coat it. Like, you don't want to like over coat it, because sometimes the wax can kind of gum up if you're using a heavier weight linen thread on a too light of a textile. It starts to kind of gum up and it doesn't look good. If you're working with a super, super fine fabric, like for example, like cotton muslin, I would not recommend using even a fine linen. I would actually recommend using a fine silk. I like to use the Gutermann silks for my fine muslins. They're not super shiny, they're strong, and they do a lovely job with that fabric. Thank you for your question. Next question is, what is the best stitch to use on jacket seams, back and sides? And what is the best method to line a jacket? It's a very good question. And that is actually quite an involved question, just because there's so many different types of jackets out in the world. So when it comes to an unlined jacket, I would recommend using a flat felled seam. So I'd back stitch your seam together first, and then I would open the seam, fold those raw edges over, and fell them in place. And for a tutorial on how to do flat felled seams, I have a free tutorial on my YouTube channel, and that will be linked below so that you can practice your flat felled seams. Now, as it relates to a jacket that does have a lining, like I said, there's a variety of different types of jackets that have different types of construction details, but I'm going to go through one of them today that is probably akin to the jacket that you're making in some capacity. This is the jacket. This is the back of the jacket of the design I'm referring to. So it has that center back seam, and it has side seams, and then essentially it has like a natural kind of pleat there at the bottom. But a short jacket that has side seams and a center back seam. This type of jacket is the construction method I'm going to go through. The interior of it looks like this, where you stitch a back stitch to create the center back seam, and then you also back stitch the side seams. And then you lay over the lining over top of that seam to encase it. So I'm actually going to go through that now. So I'm going to pretend like this is our center back seam, and this will be our front panel. So we're kind of going to act like we're working with kind of one half of the body of, say, a lined bedgown, or even like a more fitted jacket. Okay, so we've got our pieces of fabric. So the red linen is going to act like our lining. And then the floral fabric, this is going to be our outer fabric. And so this is going to be our center back seam here. So we've got our beautiful fitted jacket back right here. And what we're going to do is actually sew the outer fabric and the lining together all at once. So I'm going to put right sides together, and then the lining, and then the lining. So you're looking at 4 pieces of fabric. So we have outer fabric, lining, lining, and it's right sides together on the outer fabric, meaning that the outer material are kissing one another. So this is the wrong side, this is the wrong side, and then the 2 layers of linen on top of it. And then you're going to do a back stitch And I did a tiny, of course, like a tiny little piece just for the sake of this demonstration. I'm just going to pin these together really quickly. And then I'm just going to do a really quick back stitch. And this is going to be encased, so you're not going to see this at all. And the reason why I'm going to do a back stitch is because it's very strong. I would recommend doing a back stitch at about 8 stitches per inch. So what I'm doing is I'm dipping my needle into the fabric and I'm rocking it back up on the other side of the tail. The distance between where I go back to reach my other stitch and then forward is actually the same distance. So that's how I can kind of eyeball having even stitches. Keeping my needle perpendicular to the material. I'm not sewing like this. I'm keeping it parallel to my body. And I'm not stab stitching. I'm going through all the layers all at once. And I'm using my thimble to push my needle through the fabric. My non-dominant hand, which is my left hand, is also part of this process. I am kind of holding it with my left hand and kind of rocking this fabric so that it meets the needle as it comes up. So it gives it a nice fluid motion. And for a more in-depth tutorial, I have a hand sewing sampler video on my YouTube that you can check out and practice your back stitching, practice your running stitches, and practicing your felling or your hemming. They're actually the same type of stitch. Okay, so then once we're done sewing our back seam, I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to knot it on the other side. And I knot by doing just kind of picking up a little bit of the material, making a loop, going through this twice, pulling it, and then I'm going to clip it off. I don't have a pair of tiny scissors, so I'm just going to use my bigger dressmaker scissors. But I would recommend having a small pair of scissors on hand. And then when we open this up, you know, of course, these would be mirror images. There wouldn't be a smaller piece and a bigger piece. These would actually be the same dimensions. But I'm just demonstrating the kind of order of operations. So we open this up, and now we have our lining, which is actually pushed to one side. But what we're going to do is we're going to have the seam allowance go in the same direction. So all of the seam allowance is going to go in one direction when we open up our outer fabric and we press it with an iron. And then we're going to fold over the seam allowance to then encase the raw edge. So on the cross section of it, you're going to have your lining and then your outer fabric here. So that can be your center back seam. And let me pin this down just so that we'll pretend like I ironed it so you can get a better sense of what that center back seam will look like. And so now you've got your outer fabric and your center back seam sewn. If you're going to do your side seams, and then you would do a kind of a similar but slightly different technique. So instead of doing all of your fabric together, you're going to do 3 of your layers together. In this case, you actually want to do your back panel lining, back panel outer fabric, and then your front panel right side of fabric. And you'll back stitch all of that together. You'll open this up, and then you will lay your lining on top of it and fold this back and fell that into place like you would for gown bodices. Again, this is your center back seam. This is your outer fabric of your back. we're going to pretend like this is the outer fabric for the front of your bodice. And at this point, the lining for the front of your bodice should also be attached. So I'm going to actually pin this in place as if we've already stitched it. Okay, so we've got front of our bodice, back of our bodice. And we're going to do the right sides together, and then only the linen lining of the outer fabric. And then we're going to back stitch that together. And as you're back stitching, you want to make sure that this linen piece for your outer fabric, your lining, your front bodice lining, is not actually part of the seam. We just want to push it away with our hands. This is a small little piece, so in this case, like it's not as real. When you're doing it for real, it'll stay out of the way. But I just want to reiterate, I'm stitching my back lining, my back outer panel, and then my front outer bodice piece all together. So there's 3 layers of fabric together. I'm just doing this kind of quickly, just so that I can show you how this is done. All right, so now that I've backstitched my side seams, if I were to open this up, center back seam, side seam, lining that's already been attached to the fronts by being felled in. We want to make sure that this seam is nice and open by pressing it. So we give it a good pressing with an iron. And then this, all that happens with this raw edge, it's super easy. All you do is you fold it back and you make sure that it's covering the stitching line, just on the other side of the stitching line. Pin that into place. And then you do a felling stitch here. And a felling stitch is the same type of stitch that you use for applique. It's the same type of stitch you use for hemming. And all it does is it just holds this folded edge, encases the raw edge, and it holds that folded edge to the lining. And when you're stitching, you want to make sure that it's only really going through the lining and you don't want it to go to the outer fabric. So again, we've got our backstitched back seam, our backstitched side seam, and then the lining that folds over it and fells it in place. So to fell this in place, you're just going to make sure again that folded edge is right over top of on the other side of the stitching line. And I'm going to put my needle through just the fold of the fabric, pull it in, and then the knot's going to lock in. And then I'm going to go ahead and progress and do my hem stitch. When I do a hem stitch, I'm going to push my needle into just the lining and then come out a little bit ahead and the fold. So my needle is actually, I'm right-handed, and so I'm doing right to left. I'm going to dip my needle down into the fabric slightly to the left of where this tail is. And then I'm going to push it kind of in the same motion through the fold. And I want to make sure that needle goes through the fold only about maybe like 2 yarns or 1 yarn away from the edge of that fold. It's not going to be invisible. You are going to be able to see it. But all you're doing is just stitching that fold to the lining. So you can see how that's starting to be felled in place. And again, I have a tutorial of how to hem, and that same hemming technique is used to fell. I want to note that I've seen a lot of people when they first start to fell, they want to fell like this, and that's kind of a common way it's being taught. And the problem with felling this direction for kind of the standard way of holding your hands is that when you fell this way, you have a tendency to actually pick up more fabric, and it's going to pucker. when you sew like this, when you sew right to left and you keep your needle perpendicular to the work, it's going to be a little bit more smooth of a look. So I would really encourage you to keep your needle parallel to the work. You're only picking up a little bit of fabric. You're only picking up a little bit of the lining, and then you're only going through just a smidge of that fold. And sometimes it knots, and that's okay. And we pick it up and there we go. So I know that right now it's kind of invisible, but it's not an invisible stitch. It is actually visible from the inside of your clothing. It's not seen on the outside. So again, you're only picking up the lining section. And so that encases that seam. And then you would do the same thing on the other side. So again, I'm only doing essentially like half of what that bodice would be. And then to knot this off here at the top, I'm going to take another stitch and I'm going to go through this loop. I'm going to pull it and then I'm going to hide it in between the layers, and then I'm going to clip that. And then it's hidden. So there you have it. That's how you can do a side seam and a back seam. I just want to say thank you all for your questions, and it's been really enjoyable to answer them for you. If you have any more questions, I will be continuing to run this help desk through the end of January. So feel free to ask another question for clarification, or just if you have another question. Also, I do offer private lessons. I offer private lessons for 30 minutes and for 1 hour. So if you are stuck on something, if you're trying this technique and for some reason it just doesn't make sense, or you're trying to make this jacket, but the instructions are done in a more modern method, but for hand sewing, feel free to send me an email at sewncompany@gmail.com and we can get together and work out the issues. Well, happy sewing, and I'll talk to you soon.